Let's make some bias tape. I like making my own bias tape because I get to pick out my own fabrics, but also once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy. You're going to start with a piece of fabric. Depending on how much bias tape you need will depend on the size. I have a piece here that's roughly a fat eighth. You'll also need your bias tape maker. I'm going to be using 3/4 of an inch, so I'm using the 18mm or 3/4 of an inch tape maker. This one is by Clover. I really like it. You're going to need your rotary cutter, cutting mat, and your ruler. And now the ruler you'll want to make sure has 45-degree markings on it. To start, I've got my piece of fabric here that I'm going to be making my bias tape with. Bias tape is cut on the bias, so that's a really key part about making bias tape. A beauty about bias tape is that because it's cut on the bias, that means that it has more flexibility. It'll bend around curves, it'll stretch, it's much more easier to manipulate. So I've got my selvage here, and our bias is going to be cut at a 45-degree angle from the selvage. I'm going to go ahead and trim off my selvage. Okay. And now I am going to take my ruler, and it does have 45-degree markings. So I'm going to line up one of the 45s here on this straight edge. You want to make sure that your piece is roughly a rectangle or a square. You want to make sure that these lines are parallel to each other. It just makes it a little easier when you're sewing your strips together. I have my ruler lined up with my fabric, 45-degree angle here. I just went ahead and matched up this line with the corner of my piece, and I'm going to cut my first diagonal like that. And so since I'm using this 18mm or 3/4 of an inch tape maker, I'm going to need to cut my fabric 1 3/8 of an inch in width. And you'll cut as many strips as you need to get the length that you need. But now I'm just going to use my ruler, line it up at 1 3/8 of an inch, like that. Cut my strips. A lot of times when I'm making bias tape, I'll go ahead and cut extra so that I have a little bit of a bias tape stash to work from. Comes in so handy because you can always use bias tape for things, and if you've already got some made that will work, then all the easier. So I'm going to go ahead and cut several strips here because I like this color and I think it'll be nice to have a little stash of it to work from. Okay, so I could keep cutting strips from these pieces, or I'm just going to save them. But now I've got my strips. I'm going to take them to the machine to sew them together. So the ends go together like this. I make sure that the angles match. I flip them right sides together. And you want like 1/4 of an inch distance here and here. And so now I'm going to drop my needle down at that point and sew together. So you can see I've matched them up 1/4 of an inch there and sewed a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm going to trim my dog ears. And I like using a seam roller. I like to use a seam roller to then press it open. And I'll sew the next one. Now we're going to take it to the iron to give a good press. I've sewn my pieces together, and now I'm going to give them a good press. Okay, so now I've got my bias tape maker, and you're going to take your strip with the wrong side facing up. I'm going to feed it through this bottom part, feed it through that little section there. Oops. Like that, and you'll pull it through. If you ever have trouble pulling the fabric through, one thing that you can use is just take a sewing pin, and most bias tape makers have a little section here that's open, and so after you feed your fabric through, you can use the pin to grab the fabric and pull it through, and then once you have it through, you're able to pull it with your fingers. So now I'm going to make sure that it's feeding through evenly. So not too far this way, not too far that way. You want a good even feed through the bias tape maker. And then as it's coming out, I'm going to pull it back a little bit because I want this end to have good creases on it too. So I'm just gonna quickly follow up with a good press. If you want to use a pressing agent, flatter or some kind of spray, that can work really well. I also have a wool ironing mat under this piece of fabric. I find that that really gives me a very good press. Once you come to the seam, I'm going to make sure that the seam allowance is open as I pull it through. And then you'll just press, pull your fabric through and press it for the entire length of the strip. And sometimes what I like to do too is to give it a good press from the other side. Having a good crease in your bias tape is really going to be helpful when you go to install it. And that's how you make bias tape.